So tonight, Mark is going to be talking to us about gender differences in marriage. He's taking on this really challenging subject. And this is something that nearly all of us struggle with. Mark's going to lead us in discovering God's plan for the battle of the sexes through the Bible. And he's going to show us how that plan is consistent from Genesis to Revelation. Welcome, Mark. It's really good to have you here.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So as just an introduction to this, I just wanted to read Ephesians chapter 5. Not all of it, just a few verses, starting at verse 25. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. So that was Ephesians chapter 5. So Mark, what got you interested in marriage? I mean, a lot of men don't like reading relationships books. Wouldn't be seen dead reading a relationship book, let alone writing one. So what's given you that special interest?
So I suppose I've always been a very curious person in many different areas, and I've always, to be honest, I've always enjoyed the sort of self-help genre of books of all types. And being married and realizing that that takes up a big amount of one's life, and it's quite important. It was natural that I would start to read in that area, and a lot of interesting stuff that you read as well. But of course, the real question is, what does the Bible have to say about it? And I suppose the Bible study aspect of it started with wanting to say something to at youth groups and for teens. So I developed a series of talks for the teen session when I was speaking at Bible school on relationships, because it felt to me there was a lot of biblical content on the subject that I wasn't sure was being talked about necessarily enough. So I gave that a few times, and then it occurred to me, actually, there's quite a lot of this that would be relevant to a wider audience. But at that time, I was probably in my mid to late 30s, and I felt that it wasn't really appropriate for me to. I was too young, basically, to be having a lot to say about the question. It felt a bit slightly weird. But then it struck me that actually, if you approach the subject by looking at, there's a lot of snapshots or cameos of married men and women, and of men and women generally in the scriptures. And it struck me that if you took it as a biblical study and you looked at those, starting with Genesis, and of course marriage starts in Genesis 2, right, and it goes right until the very last chapter of the Bible, and so it wends its way all the way through. So if you follow that and let the Bible guide you and the principles come out of that, and then you add a few practical thoughts and insights along with that, then that might be a way of doing it. So that was my approach, which I originally trialed like 10 or 12 of these in the Christadelphian and got reasonably positive feedback. So I thought, okay, let's do something bigger. So we ended up with about 50 or so biblical couples. So it ended up as quite a big book, actually. But
this is your book.
Yeah. So your book, for better or for worse. Put it that way. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And just recently you've also put out a workbook. Yeah,
so really the book does do that. So it takes several sections. It takes, what are the biblical foundations of marriage? What does marriage mean? What does gender mean? what are they for? And then it goes through, there's a section on dating and finding a partner, and then one on the husband, one on the wife, one on sex, one on communication, one on difficulties in marriage, and one about how to sort of learn to be united through the differences that we have. So that's the basic format of the thing. And then we felt that the Christadelphian office actually said to me, could we have some kind of a workbook? Because I think that it was apparent that a lot of ecclesias were doing marriage courses and marriage instruction when people were getting married, and using non-Christadelphian material, because there wasn't a lot of Christadelphian material.
There isn't a lot, no.
Some of the non-Christadelphian material is very good, and some of it is less good. But why not do something ourselves? So I put the workbook together. It's quite funny, actually. So I wrote all these discussion questions and exercises and so forth, and then I gave it to Anita to read it, as I always do everything I write. And she read it and said, if anyone reads this, you can be sure they won't get married. So I went back to the drawing board, and there's nothing more annoying, actually, than rewriting a book that you've already written. And the problem was that it's one of those things about my character that's a strength and a weakness. I tend to be quite systematic, so I'd just written too many questions, and it was like this barrage of questions that would just be completely off-putting. So I massively hacked it down, and there's still probably too many questions. So if anyone does get it and have a look, what I would say is, the idea is not that you answer all the questions, but hopefully there are some questions in there that are interesting and useful. Do those, but please don't feel you need to do the whole thing.
Right.
So the idea is some of it topics that you can discuss with your partner. Some of it's for like meditation on your own. Some of it is exercises where you actually write in the book. There's a mixture of things. So what I'm hoping is that there'll be something that appeals to everybody, but certainly not everything will appeal to you by any means.
Yeah, I must say I'm partway through reading your book, the textbook rather than the workbook, and I'm really enjoying it and thoroughly recommend it to anyone who wants to get hold of it. It's a very good book, very biblically written, and very encouraging. Yeah, so thank you for that.
So tell us the differences between men and women. We're going to begin now on the gender differences.
I mean, some of them are fairly obvious.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Some of us are looking that up.
Perhaps it's perhaps worth saying at the start that before we start to talk about the differences, most of what the Bible says to human beings, it says to us all, right, whatever gender we are. So I don't know what the percentage is. Is it 95% or 99%, even 98%? I don't know. But what does the Lord require of us, whether we're male or female? It's the same thing. We're both made in the image of God. There's a male version and there's a female version, and you see that in Genesis, where the man and the woman are blessed by God together and told to be fruitful and multiply and to have dominion. And they're both caught in sin. They're both expelled from the garden, and the means of salvation that's pointed out in that in the shedding of blood and the coats of skins, it's the same means of salvation. So we stand in common need before God, and we receive a common salvation. And so, and that's there in Genesis very clearly, and it's there in the New Testament very clearly. So there's no distinction. And some people do want to drive this wedge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think it's one of the great strengths of our Christadelphian understanding of the Bible, that we don't see it that way. We see the Bible as this integrated whole. Yes, there are different stages of God's purpose, certainly. But so when Paul says there is neither male nor female, and other passages in the New Testament that speak about our common salvation, and about men and women together receiving the gospel, that's entirely in keeping. That's consistent through the scriptures. Yet, of course, that's only part of the story, and there are these differences. So yeah, sorry about all that preamble, but I just think it's really important to say that most aspects of discipleship are common to us, irrespective of gender. But then when we say, well, what are the differences? Well, then that's when it becomes tricky, isn't it? Because that's a highly politicized question nowadays. And, it's one of those things where you have to think really carefully about what it is that comes out of your mouth in case you accidentally say the wrong thing, and the thought police, get you for saying something that's, desperately politically incorrect. But I mean, we could start with the really obvious, as you rightly said. It's like, well, there seem to be some physical differences here, right? Our reproductive apparatus is quite different. There are other physical differences. The male skeletal structure is generally bigger, and there is more muscle mass on the male. So there are physical differences, and so is that it then? Is it just a physical thing? And other than that, we're identical? Well, I think we all know that's not the case, don't we? And you can go down a scientific road, and you can say, well, we now understand that there are neurological differences. So it seems that there are more connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain in the female than there are in the male brain, typically speaking. And then the psychologists can do their work, and they can, we can examine how males tend to behave and females tend to behave in different situations. And there are differences towards attitudes towards sex, and needs in sex are different. We can think about things that males and females tend to be interested in, and the jobs that they tend to do. Now, and again, they're different. Generally speaking, there are more males who are interested in watching other males kick a piece of leather around a field than there are females who are interested in watching either men do that or women do that. And there are women who want to do that. So that's it's like a trivial point, but in a way, it's just so obvious that there are these differences. And of course, there's, for the strong feminists, there is a response to that where they'll say, well, that's all culturally determined. It's a constructed reality rather than an actual reality. But I think it's quite unpersuasive, really, the reading and that reasoning. And I'm not a great expert in feminist literature, but I have deliberately gone out to read some of it. And for some of it, you would, when you bring that into a religious context, what would you be saying if you go down that road? You'd be saying, that God, well, men and women have had, behaved in certain ways for centuries, for thousands of years, and there's this perspective in the Bible, but God didn't really understand gender until Simone de Beauvoir and Germaine Greer and Cordelia Fine and these people came along to explain it to him. And then, God realized that, oh yes, actually, that was a bit old-fashioned what I'd said. I mean, it's completely ridiculous that would be the case. So, of course, the surface of how we conduct life does change through time, and there's scope for cultural variation in that. But it seems to me that society is quite confused. It sort of grudgingly admits, or sometimes it doesn't, that there are these differences that, as I say, they interest psychology, physiology, emotional differences. There are these differences. Society doesn't really have a paradigm for explaining those things, and yet when we turn to the Bible, they're explained in pages 1, 2, and 3, and it continues right the way through to Revelation. And for me, this is like a really powerful preaching point. The Bible knew this about us, and so we turn to Genesis 2, and man and woman are made in completely different ways, and different things are asked of them, and different punishments are given to them. Now, if it is the case that, you know, our brains are wired differently, we are psychologically different, we're interested in different stuff, that entirely fits with what we find in Genesis. It doesn't fit the modern narrative about gender. And sorry, I realize I've gone on for a while. Let me just make one more point. You know, when you go into that feminist literature and, you know, they try to make the case that, oh, well, you know, boys only play with trucks and the girls only play with dolls because, you know, because you fed them to them in that way. And so actually they're all, you know, there are no differences. You can feel that tension when you read what they've written, because they end up saying, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong. It's all culturally constructed. But then you say, so do you think men and women are identical? Oh, no, they're not identical. Well, so what are the differences then? And then, and at least as far as what I've read, then there's a kind of a silence. They've
painted themselves into a corner and basically don't know where to go from there. Yeah. Interesting. You talked about Adam and Eve, you know, and how God right at the beginning created different roles, different purposes, different ways of different things for the man and the woman to do. Do you want to tell us about that? You know, what roles should we be playing biblically? What are our biblical roles? What were Adam and Eve's biblical roles?
Yeah, so it's interesting in Genesis 2. So the instruction to the man. So man, of course, is created first, and you say, well, I suppose God could have created them like absolutely simultaneously, but he chose not to do that. He chose to create the man first. Well, is that an accident? Is there any significance to that? And we might say, well, you know, you think there is. I don't think there is. Well, we actually know that there is, because the New Testament tells us that is significant, right? For Adam was first formed, and then Eve, and of course Christ is the firstborn. So even in Genesis, it's embedded, isn't it, that actually what it is to be male and female is not an end in itself. It's neither a biological accident, nor is it an end in itself. There's actually a typology here. So Genesis is telling us about how it all began. But it's, of course, it's not just telling us about that. You know, the man is created first. All things are put under his feet. That sounds like typological language. The woman is created from his side while he sleeps. And there they are in, you know, in this garden, in this paradise, and they receive God's blessing, and they're to be in fellowship together, which is again more resonant language, isn't it, from a spiritual perspective, and they're to be fruitful together. They're to bring forth fruit through their union. And all of that, of course, is how it will be with, you know, how it was with God and Israel, or how it was meant to be, and how it will be with Jesus and his bride. So that's there in Genesis. So so in the firstness of Adam, and God's giving his commands to Adam, and then Eve, of course, is to help him, so that together, with united front, they now try to fulfill the commandment that God had given Adam. So in a way, Adam is kind of the representative of the family, which again, well, this is language now that we would use to talk about the atonement, isn't it? Adam is sort of the interface between the family, you know, as soon as there are other families, and the outside world. And Eve's responsibilities are more within the family. So, and if we follow through what happens in the punishments and the nature of the fall, that is borne out. So when the fall happens, of course, we know that chronologically speaking, it's Eve who is the first to sin. So God would be entirely justified, one would think, in saying to Eve first, why is it you've done this? But he doesn't. He goes to Adam, because it was to Adam that the commandment was given. And then he goes to Eve, and then he goes to the serpent. And then when the punishments are given out, they're given back in reverse order again. So, you know, Adam and Eve go in diametrically the opposite order of what they should have done, where the animal suggests to the woman, and of course the man and the woman were to have dominion over the animals, but the animal suggests to the woman, and then the woman gives to the husband, whereas of course God's command had been given to him, and he was supposed to ensure that it was fulfilled in his family. So that's some of the aspects of the man's responsibilities, and that's the sin in the family, even though it was not chronologically introduced by him, is put at his door, and death is put at his door, for as in Adam all die. So the woman is given the particular aspects brought out for her. And of course she has the suffering of childbirth, and that whole thing of, you know, it's structural to the woman's life, this, isn't it? You know, in the menstrual cycle, that it's something that men don't participate in at all. And of course the pain of childbirth and what is emotionally involved in childbirth. You know, a man can't begin to imagine what that is like, what that means.
There's definitely a lot more bonding between the mother and the baby than there is with the father and the baby, as a general rule.
That's right. And so that's brought out in Genesis, isn't it? And of course Adam describes her as the mother of all living, which, again, you can read that in different levels. One of the things that's so fascinating to me about Genesis is that it is so rich, isn't it? It's like you never stop seeing new things in it. And I'm sorry about the noise of my dog, by the way. I don't know if you can hear that. I think she wants to go outside. I forgot to do that before we started.
We've just got a bird.
We're struggling with a bird right now.
Right. Well, I can't hear that, so hopefully you can't hear the dog. Yeah, so the mother of all living, and of course you say, well, that's just saying that all human beings were descended from Eve. Well, is it just saying that, really? The mother of all living. You could have used a different expression. I just think that's quite a rich expression, and I think it talks to the concern and the connection that, you know, again, generally speaking, and when we talk about gender differences, of course we're talking in generalizations. Of course, there are some men who are more X, Y, Z than some women, and vice versa. That will always be the case. But we're talking about what is generally the case, and that sort of emotional awareness and connection, that empathy, that caring and nurturing, that is, I think, and why should we not say it? Or why should we be scared of saying it? That is something that is, generally speaking, more characteristic of a woman, and it's captured for me in that phrase, the mother of all living. So, you know, you could say, well, is this only for women who have children? And I don't think that's the case. And you see that in something like Deborah, right? When Deborah is the mother in Israel, there are no diapers or nappies involved in that scene. It's not just about, you know, what role a woman plays with small children, massively important though that is. It's a bigger role of care for her family, but for all things, for the ecclesia, and perhaps even more widely than that. And you know, you can see elements of that in Proverbs 31 too.
Yeah.
So what would you describe the role of a husband and a father to be? How do we see that from scripture?
And I'll ask the next question.
Yeah, so that, I suppose that gets us into the subject of, so we've talked about that firstness in Genesis, and again, this is a thing I just think where we see this consistency through scripture. You know, this is an Old Testament and a New Testament thing, and of course it's explained most fully when we get to Ephesians 5. So I suppose if you could just have two passages on marriage, I suppose you would have, well, certainly I would. I don't know about you, whether you'd pick the same ones. You'd perhaps have your Genesis passages and Ephesians 5.
Yeah, that would be two of the most important, definitely.
Yes, Yeah. So the New Testament uses this language of headship. So it talks, and we've got to hold these things in tension. There is this equality of status, which we saw in Genesis and which is there in the New Testament as well. We're both equal in God's sight and in need of the same salvation as male and female, but different roles are asked of us, and I think that plays out in two places. I think it plays out in family life, and I think it plays out in ecclesial life as well. But when we think, perhaps to say what does it mean? Well, if we take that idea of the man as representing the family and as being the head, the spiritual head of the family, then we need to unpack what does that mean, and to do that you have to be
challenging to a guy.
Yes, it is. No, absolutely it is. Yeah, but for me, this is a very powerful thing. It's been said by a number of modern writers that there's a sort of a crisis of maleness, that males don't know what to do with themselves anymore. There was a time when we used to go out and do physical stuff that we were better suited for than, like digging ditches and so forth, and, building things. And of course, some people still do that and get a lot of fulfillment from it. But a lot of us now, I sit there all day doing this on a computer and talking on telephone calls. My gender isn't really relevant to that, I suppose. So what are men for? And if we say, well, what is it that's distinctively male? Well, it was like playing on an Xbox and crime. These are some of the things that men stand out for, and competitive sports, as I've mentioned already, in distinction to women. And there was a time. Well, so those are some things. So is that it then? Is that what maleness is about now? And of course, the scriptures, please no. Yeah. The scriptures tell us no, there is something really to aspire to here, and it is to aspire to represent Christ. And there is no higher calling than that a man could have, whether he's married or not. It is to be Christ-like. And what's our model for headship? Our model for headship is to try to be as the sort of head that Christ was. And it is this sacrificial leadership, isn't it? Self-sacrificial leadership, servant leadership, sometimes it's called. So we need to think about how Christ led, and then I, as a man, need to think about how can I be more like that. So when I think about how I can try to be a spiritual head in my family, that would hopefully include things like trying to set the spiritual direction for the family, and then asking for my wife's help in implementing that in the family, because I can't do it alone. And that was why the woman was created as a help, so that we could hopefully do that together. So, when Joshua, as for me and my house, I will serve, we will serve the Lord. That is kind of the phrase, I think, that captures what I ought to be trying to do as a spiritual head. But then we think about what else is Christ's leadership about? Well, he came to do a work of sacrifice. He came to bring salvation. And it's my responsibility to seek above all things the salvation of my wife, to do whatever I can in my family to ensure that she is saved and presented as a glorious bride, right? So there's that aspect of it. There's there can be an aspect of leading in the scriptures and worship, making sure the family is focused on worshiping God as a family unit. Christ's work is all about forgiveness. I can be the one who looks to say sorry first, who looks to lead in reconciliation. Of course, in every relationship, there are times when we get out of sync, when we fall out about things, when there's a chill in the air in the marriage. What am I doing as the spiritual head to try to bring about that reconciliation that God would seek, that unity that he would seek in the family. And of course, all of those things are to some degree our mutual responsibility. But just as it wasn't like in the garden that it didn't matter that Eve had sinned, and so God just went to Adam because it was only him who was important. Of course, that's not the case. But God goes to Adam first, and then he goes to Eve. And similarly, when we think about family, I think it's a similar thing, where the man, as it were, carries the can in that sense for that spiritual direction, and he needs to seek the help of his wife in making sure the family is indeed headed in the right way and is implementing that goal. Does that make sense?
So it does make sense. It actually makes me feel very small. I've got a long way to go, and I presume hopefully others have too. But please forgive me.
But we want to be aspirational, don't we? It's like
we need something to aim for. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christ is that idea. Yeah. So okay, let's turn the tables now. What about women? What about wives and mothers? What's their role?
So we talked a bit about the Genesis part. So what is the New Testament equivalent of that? Well, it's what Ephesians 5 now takes that and talks about the wives submitting, doesn't it? Which of course is difficult. That's a difficult word. And we talked about the challenges of political correctness, and of course that's not a word that one would choose to use at all in
politically correct word.
Yeah, in that world of modern culture. So we need to think about that. We need to think about what that means. And for me, the clearest way of thinking about that is to say that it's about giving the husband the space and allowing him to be, allowing him to step up to the role of being what he is supposed to be. And that is in her gift. And I remember once hearing a non-Christadelphian pastor, a chap called Woody Bauckham, talking about this, and he made that point very powerfully. He said, if this model of Christ and the church, if the woman does not give space for the husband to do that, if he doesn't support him and try to help him to raise his game to step into that role, what is he going to do? Is he going to arm wrestle her for it, for that headship? And of course, the idea of the husband and the wife arm wrestling for, who's going to be head here, is completely ridiculous. And that was his point about how ridiculous that would be. So the only way, that this can work is if the woman tries to allow it to be the case. Is prepared to say, well, actually, God made us, and He does know what is best. He does know what is the best recipe for our marriage, and so I'm going to try to do this. So I think for me, that's what the submission is about. It's about allowing him and giving him the support to be what God has asked him to be. Now,
how does he do that if he's not naturally stepping up to the plate?
Yeah, so that's a difficult one, isn't it?
Female, we often kind of just automatically sort of step into that role if we think that's not happening. And then we tend to tread on top of the things that we perhaps shouldn't be treading on top of.
And then he feels put down and useless.
Yeah.
That's right. So that is indeed how it can break down. And I think it's quite difficult to answer that in general terms, because every relationship is different, right? And the reason why it's not working in the case of one particular husband and wife will probably be different depending on their own their own, mix of psychologies and so forth. I mean, I think that, it is true that I think it's innate in a husband to want to please his wife and to want his wife to think well of him, and so he does care he does care about what his wife cares about, and he wants to please her. And so if the most important thing in the world is for her to go on 6 glamorous holidays a year to exotic locations, if that is the most important thing for her, then he will try in some way or other, he will try to make that happen, and it may or may not be possible. But I just picked that as some random, not particularly spiritual goal, but it's like it's a goal for many people, and it's like it's fine to go on holiday. Of course, I'm not knocking going on holiday, but of course, if what he really wants is something which is spiritual, then a husband will want to try to please her and will want to try to make the family that environment. So I think that thing about the woman's influence, and of course it's not through nagging, it has to be a more subtle influence than that, and we've got examples of that in the scriptures of women doing exactly that. So I think with that, I suppose the other thing to point out is, because you're absolutely right, what happens if the man is not delivering? If the man is, well, thanks for tea, I'm now going to go and play on my Xbox, what is she going to do? Is she going to say, okay, well, that's it then, we can't do the readings tonight because Dad's playing his Xbox? No. And of course, there are many things in our lives that are not ideal as they should be, and so you have to do the best thing that you can in those circumstances then. And again, there are examples of that too, and I'll just quote one example. There are other examples like this, that when the man does not step up, that the woman then needs to step up. It's like there are competing scriptural principles, aren't there? There's trying to do God's will in the family, and there's following the pattern of Ephesians 5. And if the pattern of Ephesians 5 isn't working, well, that doesn't mean that okay, well, let's forget about God in this family then because my husband's not interested. Not at all. So the example I'd like to give is that weird one in Exodus 4 where Moses is going to be the savior of the Israelites, and the angel of the Lord tries to kill him on the way when they're at the inn. The bloody husband and the foreskins cast on the ground. I mean, it's a strange incident, isn't it? But I think the message of that incident is Moses should have circumcised probably his son. It's a bit ambiguous in the passage, and he hadn't done what he should have done. And so the mother, and she's not even an Israelite mother, has to step in and do what Moses should have done, and she does, and she doesn't take. And she's actually angry about it, but she does what needs to be done. She steps up when he fails to do that, and I think that's the right thing to do. Yeah. But then it's like, how do you do it? How do you step up, isn't it? And there's a right way and there's a wrong way of doing that, as there is in everything that we do. So that would be that. I just want to come back. So we've talked about the submission thing a little bit, and obviously there's a whole load of other stuff there perhaps, but what else do the scriptures say about the woman's role? Well, of course, they use the language of the helping in Genesis, and that together the man and the woman discharge the responsibilities that are given to the man. And of course, the other thing then is the piece about the woman as the bringer of life, and therefore the bringer of hope. So that is picked up, of course, about being saved in childbearing. That is picked up in the New Testament passages that talk about the woman's responsibility towards the household, sort of inward family-centered focus. And when we just think about how important the work with children is, if there are children in a family. But that thing about women as the bringer of life, that again goes through the scriptures and comes up in all sorts of places where you don't expect it. It's there in Judges 13. It's like, what is it doing there when Samson is born And you've got this passage about the woman, the woman, the woman, the woman, the woman, and how she should teach her son. Of everything that I have told the woman, let her beware. This is her responsibility. And that's brought out in the New Testament as well. And Samson, of course, is the seed of the woman. And it's just this little cameo of how Genesis, what God promises in Genesis, is ultimately going to be delivered in the New Testament. And so women have this, this wonderful responsibility of being the bringers of life, whereas men are the bringers of death. And they're nurturing that life and shaping that life and caring for it. And that, of course, applies, as I've already said, to children, but it applies in that broader sense as well in the ecclesia for women who are not married as well as those who are. So those are some aspects of it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a lot of differences, which we've seen. Are there certain needs that men and women have that the opposite gender is supposed to fulfill?
I think so, yes. So again, if you read the literature on differences, I think that becomes clear. I think God has wired us differently in terms of our sexual needs, and sometimes we can find that quite frustrating, right? We think it would be so much easier if God had wired us exactly the same, and then I suppose that becomes a matter of faith, doesn't it? Of trusting that we are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made, and that if there's this sort of indiscriminate aspect of the male sexual drive, and the man having to possess his vessel, to use scripture language to talk about that, and and of course there are aspects in which that's a challenge for women as well, and I don't mean to say otherwise, but perhaps as a relatively intense consistent pressure through time, that's something that a man has to manage. And that's a real challenge of discipleship, and I know you've talked about some issues to do with that on the last session, I think. And of course the woman is wired differently there, but we've got to assume here that we've got to trust that God knew what he was doing, and that there was a reason for that, and that in some way then that must be an encouragement for a man to treat his wife in a certain way, and for a woman to treat his husband in a certain way, and that ultimately things are better this way than they are some other way that we might imagine it would be if we'd have done it.
God's made us different so that we can fit and serve one another in ways that complement each other. I suppose that's right. What you're saying, yeah.
And then when we get to Ephesians 5, I find this really powerful, because again, if Ephesians 5 said something, although it says at the top of the chapter, it says not the top of the chapter, the top of the passage, it says, submit yourselves one to another. So there is a mutual submission aspect of marriage. Of course there is. And of course there is a mutual loving aspect of the marriage as well. But then when Paul turns individually to the genders, he says something that is completely different to the man than what he says to the woman. Now, why is that? Again, it's because we are actually different. And it's because there is a theology that is driving this, that Christ and the church, that's what it's really about. And of course, Paul exclaims that, doesn't he, at the end of the passage, where he says, this is a great mystery, and you thought I was talking about man and woman. No, I'm not. The real mystery is the bigger mystery. That's what it's all about. There's something more important than me and Anita and than you two. The purpose of the world is not my marriage, or my life, although often I might live as if it were, mistakenly. So I've got to keep my eyes on that. So then when we say, well, what does he say to the man and what does he say to the woman? What does he say to the man? He says, love her, love her, love her, love her. I think it's 4 times he says it. He doesn't tell the woman to love the man. Isn't that just incredible? It's astonishing that every time I look at that again, I'm amazed by it. And we might speculate why that is. Is it because it comes more naturally to the woman, and the man tends to be more emotionally constipated and forget to show the love that he should? It's like he's great at showing it when he's dating, when he's trying to win the woman, in quotes. And then he forgets. He becomes too involved with stuff, because men tend to be interested in stuff, and they can be, consumed and distracted by their careers, and they have to ensure that they don't do that, and that they remember that it's their responsibility to love their wives and to sacrifice themselves for their wives. So what Ephesians 5 does is tell the man to focus on what is difficult for him, to remember to love his wife. And hopefully in the way that she likes to be loved, to feel loved. And
it helps.
It does help, yeah, and it's important. And of course, that whole book on love languages, that's really relevant to that, isn't it? But it's also what she needs. She needs to feel loved. She has a lot of stuff that she has to cope with in her role. And what's the fuel that will help her get through that and take on that load? Well, of course, it's her relationship with God and Christ, and a sense of responsibility, and a love of her children, and all those things. But the love of her husband is a key ingredient in enabling her to do that. Now, so that's the man then. What's difficult for him is what's asked of him, and what she most needs. Whereas when we think of the woman, she's not told to love him. She's told to submit, and to reverence her husband, or to respect her husband. And of course, that's there in Ephesians 5, and there's another couple of New Testament passages that make the same point. Now, I assume that, and again, this is an assumption, but I think it's not I think it's a sensible one. That probably a similar thing applies, that this is going to be something that is difficult for her, because she knows all her husband's faults, and yet she is to treat him as if he were Christ. Now, again, that sounds crazy, doesn't it? It's like no one knows better than Anita how I am not like Christ, and what the extent, if anyone had to write a list of Mark's faults, I'm sure that she could write the longest list. And yet, in the face of that, she is asked to treat me as if I were Christ, and to respect me, and to give me that space to try to, rise to be that spiritual head. Now, and by the same token, I would suspect that that is something that is important for me. If you see a husband and wife where the wife belittles her husband, it's not a pretty thing to see, is it? And no. It's really sad, and this is something that is very difficult for a man. And we could get into the male ego and what that is, and like, isn't that a weird thing, and why does he have that, and all that? Well, he does have it, and again, presumably God knew what he was doing there, and of course the man has to manage his ego, but it's really important for a man to feel respected by his wife, that she values his opinion, and that she respects him. And if she's able to show that, then that again is a kind of a fuel that enables him to rise up to what he can be.
Yeah.
And to love her more, actually. Yeah, the more respected he feels, the more love he shows, because he just, he really treasures the one who's respecting him. So it's a beautiful picture, and it's a beautiful picture of the ecclesia's relationship, or our personal relationship to Christ. And we really thank you for bringing that out, Mark, and just helping point us back to how a marriage should look like that picture. And that's what we should be aspiring to, what we want to aspire to. And I think, like you've rightly pointed out, if we can keep our heads in the big picture rather than in the getting bogged down into the little picture, it's all about us. It's not You know, it's actually something much bigger.
Yeah, looking at Christ and his bride just really makes that big difference in a marriage that says that this is what we're actually aiming for. And I think you've pointed that out really well tonight. So thank you so much for that, Mark.
Well, thank you.
Really appreciate that. Really appreciate your early morning.
Yes. It looks like it's starting to get lighter.
Starting to get light too. Wow.
We've actually got building work at the moment, so I'm expecting the joiners to arrive at any moment and start putting up the timber frame of a building out there. So we'll see. We'll see if they arrive.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we really do appreciate you getting up so very early in the morning so that you could share this wisdom and insight with us. And yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just what's coming up next week, we're taking a break again, and on the 30th of November we have the topic Thriving with Kids in the Holidays with Josh and Anna Tunnell and Brendan and Jess Mudge. So that'll be a fun one, I'm sure, finding out what to do with the kids when the trip is long and boring and the kids are going, are we there yet? And then we have holidays. We're going to have a couple of months off, and in February we'll be back with Marriage Month. So we've got a couple of marriage programs on for you in February, so look out for that. I'll tell you a little bit more about that probably next time.
God willing.
God willing. Yeah, if you want to get the reminders about Family Matters, just remember to send me an email. That's robert@thinkythings.com. Just put Family Matters in the title bar and I will send you reminders about what's happening on Family Matters. I'll send you resources, and I think this week we have an article by Mark that was published in the Christadelphian, which we'll send out, which is a really good one, called Working Together, the Theology of Gender. Oh, there it is. Okay, don't read it now. I will send it to you in the next email. And also there's past recordings available. If you Google Pakuranga Christadelphians, it's first on the list, and you'll be able to find past recordings there.